Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Textile Talk. I'm Lucy Shakin, SAQA's Communications Coordinator and your Textile Talks organizer. Textile Talks are presented by the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA, and Surface Design Association. We love bringing you these free programs every week, thanks to the support of our sponsors and contributions from viewers like you. If you enjoy Textile Talks, please consider making a donation at saqa.com/tt support. A few Zoom notes before we begin. This is a webinar, so we can't see or hear you, but we can read your comments in the chat. If you have any questions during today's program, please type them into the Q&A function, and we'll have some time for them at the end of the program. If you have suggestions for ways we can improve or for topics that you'd like to see in future Textile Talks, please let us know in the post-event survey. We have closed captions turned on for this program. You can turn these on or off by finding the live caption or CC button in your settings. And our speaker today is Keidra Daniels Navaroli. She's a McKnight Doctoral Fellow in the Texts and Technology PhD program at the University of Central Florida. She's also the co-author of the forthcoming Oxford University Press publication, This is America, Reviewing the Art of the United States. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on the intersections of curatorial practice, digital technologies, and underrepresented communities. She's the former assistant director/curator of the Ruth Funk Center for Textile Arts at the Florida Institute of Technology, is an alumna of the Museum Leadership Institute's Next Gen program for museum leaders, and currently serves on the boards of the Association of Academic Museums and Galleries and the Surface Design Association. SAQA members might remember her contributions to SAQA Seminar 2020 and our 2022 virtual conference. So Keidra, welcome to Textile Talks. Thank you so much for being here today. And please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lucy. To you, SAQA, SDA, and all of your wonderful sponsors. It's really a pleasure to speak to you all today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that works out. Can you see that, Lucy?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Lucy, for that introduction. As I said, it's a pleasure to present this work and a little bit of my insights as a curator. So to talk a little bit, even though Lucy gave me a wonderful introduction, I did want to sort of explain what I do a little bit, because I am in a interdisciplinary program called Text and Technology that isn't always so easy to tell what that means when we say that. So as Lucy mentioned, I'm a McKnight Doctoral Fellow in the Text and Technology program at the University of Central Florida. Prior to that, I received my master's in art history back in 2007, and I'm an art historian by education. I've worked in museums since that time for the last 15 years or so. And the majority of that was spent as the assistant director and curator for 10 years at the Ruth Funk Center for Textile Arts at Florida Institute of Technology. And sort of in this space, being an art museum that was located on the campus of a STEM focused research university, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to sort of bridge the perceived gap. And I say perceived because I do think that that is the case between art and STEM based practices. So that really inspired my research when I had the opportunity to pursue a PhD in 2020 during the pandemic. I chose an interdisciplinary program because that was very much true to what my experience was, but also more appealing to what I felt my future in the field would be as well. So these are just the pictures of my previous work at the Funk Center, which, as some of you may or may not know, was a casualty of the pandemic because our university was so focused on STEM and really wanted to consolidate after losing quite a bit to enrollment. Both museums, both off-campus and on-campus museums that the university owned were closed. So again, that really sort of ignited my passion, wanting to think about the ways that art and technology intersect. So these are just images from my work at the Funk Center, an exhibition I curated in 2019 on propaganda kimono textiles in modern Japan. And even though we closed in 2020, I was still actively doing work to think about the ways that Florida Tech students, specifically in engineering, and I've had students as varied as fields as meteorology and aerospace engineering. And so we had a special work study position that was dedicated specifically to in-gallery game design. So this is one of my students, Federico Giovini, during his senior year in aerospace engineering. And he designed an application that went along with our presentation of a traveling beadwork exhibition from South Africa. And this was an education piece that we received physically that was unfinished because unfortunately the artist passed away before she was able to complete it. And so Federico, working together with myself and our audiences, developed various prototypes for the kinds of interactives that we thought a visitor might get the most out of. And so that led to this incredible application in which we invited visitors to literally complete this unfinished work in a digital sphere in our gallery. So it was great for him as an engineering student to think about ways to sort of meet client demand as he was in the galleries, testing his prototypes, interviewing visitors. So it was a really wonderful way to sort of give him the skills that he would need, even in something as perceptively different as engineering. Working within an artistic space. And so my work now as a PhD student is also engaged with thinking about the way that visitors interact in museum spaces. And so oftentimes this has resulted in sort of creative projects of my own that sort of with in particular this Mr. B's Night at the Museum that uses this horror movie icon as a way of exploring the nature of visitor isolation in museums and sort of helping people to understand the ways in which communicating with visitors and making connection points with exhibitions of various media are important. So for my talk today, I wanted to make it sort of clear that I'm thinking very specifically for my geographic region. I'm located in Central Florida, just east of Orlando on the coast. And I think it's important to sort of situate that because primarily I'm going to be talking about Florida artists today or artists based in Florida, but also because I think that whether you're an artist or a curator, it's important to consider what the sort of local, regional, economic interests are of the communities, either in which you are a part or the communities in which your art is going to be shown in. And in the case of Central Florida, as I mentioned, there is a lot of emphasis on STEM and technology that has a lot to do with our proximity to NASA and Kennedy Space Center, which I can see space shuttles from my backyard. It's a wonderful thing, but there certainly is sort of an overemphasis on STEM resources, almost to the exclusion of everything else. But that is a sort of driving force in our region and what inspires me to think from an interdisciplinary lens when it comes to the work that I do. There's also a strong focus on environmentalism. I'm on the coast, and so issues with the Indian River Lagoon here in Florida make environmentalism and sustainability top of mind in the landscape. In addition to healthcare, just with the number of people that we have here, and also tourism, of course, with Orlando being Orlando and Disney and the Mouse being sort of key points of entry for a lot of people. Tourism is another big industry. And you may ask, what does that have to do with anything? But it also informs what our visitors are looking for when they come to exhibitions. And in the case of textiles, when I started at the Ruth Funk Center, it had opened 6 months prior in 2009. And at that time, there really wasn't an understanding in Florida. It certainly wasn't widespread. There wasn't an understanding, and as a result, there wasn't an appreciation for textiles and what that definition of textiles could be. There was this very strict idea that textiles were fabric and nothing more. And so a lot of the work that we did over the last decade was thinking about expanding those definitions of what textiles can be. And our visitors, we found, were particularly interested, and I speak not just for the Funk Center, but also because I continue to work as a curator for other institutions in Florida. There's an interest from their audience now, fast forward 10 years, in process, in materiality, which is big right now, in scale and in transformation. So those are the kinds of ways that our local interests sort of make us consider the way in which textiles are presented and what audiences may be bringing to their interpretations when they enter the gallery space. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit today. At the Funk Center, we had both traveling exhibitions, which are represented here by the two shows on the right, Transformers, which was curated by a New York-based artist, China Marks, and an exhibition below that called Code Couture, which was focused specifically on art and technology, specifically the idea of couture and customization and the way that the digital age has allowed us to think about textiles in new scientifically informed ways. And so that was a show that came out of Pratt Institute in New York, guest curated by curators located here in Florida. And so even though we have done these sorts of exhibitions from a traveling perspective, doing in-house exhibitions, which the three images on the right represent, we had to sort of take different things into consideration, especially when it came to not just installation, but also how to contextualize the pieces in our space. And so I'll be talking about the exhibitions related to the three images on the right in just a moment. So with that, considerations for installation. When a visitor walks into a gallery space, what they see, right, is the end result of what is not often understood as a very long process. And I'm sure as artists, or I assume that most of people attending in the audience today are artists. And I'm sure you've seen someone see the final version of your work and say all these wonderful things and may not have the full insight into how long that process may have taken you, the things that you were considering along the way. And as a curator, even though I'm not an artist or a maker myself, I see a lot of connections and thinking about demystifying that process in a more transparent way. So that, for instance, yes, this is the final product when people come into the galleries. This was an exhibition, again, going back to that interest in sustainability for our region on a fashion installation that was focused on recycled materials. But this is how we got these works, and getting the works, unpacking them, even simply getting them through the door was an undertaking that took efforts across the university. There were forklifts, there were trucks, there were preparators, there were people that had to have a lot of considerations for not just how to physically, present them in an engaging way, but even on a practical level, just getting them through the doors of the museum. So I'm going to talk about the exhibitions that we did in-house that sort of take some of these considerations into top of mind. So I'm going to start with Light and Shadow. This was an exhibition done in 2015. It was the first that we sort of toyed with this idea of doing site-specific installations in our space. And for this particular exhibition, we worked with an artist by the name of Hei Shen. She was born in South Korea, is based in Florida. And for her, traditionally, this picture sort of represents what she usually works with, her focus on intricately layering, weaving, integrating materials such as horsehair, fiber, handmade paper. These were the things that she focused on. She has a very specific interest in thinking about the way that weaving sort of project the sense of atmosphere, a sense of place, mood, feeling. These are the kinds of things that were really interesting to her. and also exploring this idea of the dichotomy of the natural world. So thinking about, and you can see sort of the shadows literally, we hung these away from the wall so that we could give the visitors that sense of not only the physical work itself, but also the space it occupied by setting the works away from the wall so that the shadows cast by the lighting above could sort of work in a layered way that would allow viewers to see both aspects of her work. So our gallery space at the time was divided into sort of three separate sections. And this first section was dedicated to showing her work up to that point. However, we also were interested in the explorations that she was taking at that time into site-specific work with experimental materials. So this particular installation was called Sunken Dreams. It was the end point for the exhibition. It was made of wire. She works a lot in digitally printed silk. Her husband is an engineer, and so they work together on creating materials that she can use in her weavings. And this particular work was made to specifically commemorate the 2014 sinking of the South Korean ferry off the coast of Korea, in which 304 people were killed. 250 of them were children who were on a school field trip. And as a Korean artist, she took this to heart and really wanted to think about the space itself. She sort of created these clouds that were meant to be immobile, and around the perimeter, these little blue sort of satchels that she's layered with stitchings with the Korean words for dream, love, play, these ideas that sort of thinking about the dreams that these children had that they were never able to express due to their untimely death. And so the central piece is an origami shaped boat that she made using linen and hemp, which traditionally are mourning fabrics in Korea. So thinking about culturally how to express the sense of mourning and hope, again, thinking about that duality of things together in one space. And so critical to that was her physically being able to be on site. And even though she wasn't working alone, we had a team of preparators and our own collections team working with her. It was important to us to make sure that her vision was realized in a way that stayed true to the materials and to her as an artist. So the first thing I would say, certainly when it comes to considerations for these types of shows, is the availability of the artists and being able to be there on site so that you're able to really work collaboratively to make exhibitions that are effective and suit the mission of the gallery space and also the artists themselves. And so this was another work of hers called Embrace the Hope. It also incorporates wire and digitally printed silks. She had this vision for the piece to sort of think about specifically the way in which motherhood had influenced her life. So this idea of this outer shell kind of deteriorating, but inside the little red balls were all sort of digitally screen printed images of fetuses. This idea of birth coming from new life. And in addition to that was the suspension of strings that represented blood from the ceiling. And so we had to really, it was a true team effort in thinking about, you can see Shin is over here on the far left, but we had our collections manager, our preparator, even our admin assistant who's there in the pink skirt. Everyone was on hand, all hands were on deck in physically making sure that we were able to get this off the ground. And sort of this is the final result of the piece. Again, everyone working together in a collaborative way to make sure the vision for that space was realized. And again, our exhibition space was sort of divided into three. And so we really thought about each installation being its own room and allowing the space for those particular pieces and installations to breathe. So in 2016, and I will say just, it's interesting, this exhibition, Reimagine Innovations in Fiber, was sort of a happy accident. We were scheduled to present an exhibition of fashion, specifically the use of color and dyes post-World War II. And we were working with a museum that unfortunately closed at the time in 2015. And so we ended up with an exhibition hole that forced us to really think creatively about what we thought might be best in that designated time slot. And so ultimately, I curated this exhibition called Reimagine Innovations in Fiber that was specifically focused on thinking about the way that Miami-based contemporary artists manipulated fiber and thought about fiber as an experimental material and an experimental process. So they were really focused on challenging the sort of conceived notion of craft materials by redefining their function and context. And so we really wanted to make sure that both the works acted as an installation, but but also sort of thinking about how textiles reinforce the role of the medium as a sort of visually communicative and diverse art form. So we worked with two artists. The first was Carrie C. Again, she's Miami based, and this is her work, Content Creators and Luxuriated Bodies, both the finished product on the left and it in process. And Carrie is a mixed media artist who works in painting, textiles, photography, and reclaimed and repurposed materials. And so her practice itself really focuses on the role of technology, psychology, and political economy in human behavior. And so for anyone who is in Florida or will be in Florida before the end of May, she actually has an exhibition up right now called This Used to Be a Lake. It's on view at the Dimensions Variable Gallery in Miami. And it sort of digs into her own sort of reconciliation with family trauma and sort of intertwined cultural history. And so she is an artist who oftentimes in her photography work will take a photo, cut it up, manipulate it in some way, and then stitch over the top of it, sort of as a way of reclaiming order over her own personal experiences, as many of these photographs are photographs from her childhood. And in the case of this particular installation, it is site specific in that it changes the subject changes for each space in which it's installed. It is made entirely out of VHS tape, and each of those pieces that arrived in sort of a ball. And so unfolding those pieces, matching them up, and then taking individual nails to suspend the work on the wall was a process that I think without her physically being there would have been very difficult to do on our own. And so, again, thinking about working collaboratively, certainly if you're able to, with artists who are locally with you or available to come and travel to see these works. And I included the image on the right because it's interesting to sort of think about how iterative the process of installation was, because the VHS piece itself represents a mule Jenny. So she's interested in technology and textile history. And so it is a sort of abstracted image of a mule Jenny. And on the left, she usually includes a painting of some idea, some sort of quote unquote figure that would sort of challenge masculinity or represent masculinity in an interesting or subversive way. And so when we first saw this piece, the image that was painted to the left was actually an image of the wrestler Hulk Hogan. And so when she came into our space, she said, well, actually, I think I want to make it a potato plant. And so she started, experimenting with painting on the wall, and then came to us a few days later and said, you know what, I kind of changed my mind. I kind of want this to be instead of the work terminating in a potato plant, I wanted to terminate in a portrait of Freddie Mercury. So from Queen. And so it was interesting to see sort of, things aren't set in stone, certainly when you're dealing with textiles, but even when you're working with artists, ideas can come to them, inspirations can come to them, and being open to that is something that I think is always very important. And for us, it really was an exhibition that allowed, an installation, I should say, that really allowed us to sort of delve into these greater issues that she herself was dealing with. This particular work was part of a larger series on masculinity. And so it was great to have this sort of as the entry point, because it was in our introductory exhibition space for how that's conceived over time. Again, thinking about how she's doing this using mixed media. And I will say, for any of you artists or curators or museum professionals that have a problem with people touching in the gallery space, that is always a consideration that we have to have for preserving the safety of the work. And in this particular case with Carrie, it was also about preserving the safety of the visitor, because VHS tape, when you touch it without gloves, can be toxic. And again, it has to do with accumulating that toxic material on your hands. But we all had to work with gloves to make sure that the installation of this work was done in a safe way that protected both the installers, the artists, and ultimately visitors who entered the space. And so in addition to that piece, we also worked with an untitled piece that was untitled at the time. It was a panel series that, again, was her working through textile technology. So it's this 6-panel piece that included images of a mule Jenny, but also the jacquard loom, buildings, old textile mills that were important to different city sites, and sort of thinking about nature and these materials literally coming together in these embroideries. And so again, thinking about how to install this in a way that makes sense to the viewer, but also is straightforward enough for working with preparators who were on site to help us with what was a very specific installation. And I'm going to return to this when I talk a little bit about audience interaction, because that was top of mind for this particular piece and why we had to install it in the way that we did. So also a part of that exhibition was an artist by the name of Alex Tremino. Alex is born in Colombia, but also based in Miami. And Alex's work is really informed by traditional uses of craft, sort of the idea of technology, civilization, gender, but she's really focused on thinking about the way that old things can become new through technology, through bringing these things together, thinking about how we make these connections to the world in which we live today, and also thinking about this sort of imposed difference between past and present and wanting to bring all of that together. And for us, she was really excited by the fact that the Funk Center had a global collection, so our permanent collection included objects from all over the world. And she wanted to use those objects as a source of inspiration for her weaving. So in the particular case of this show, we made sure to have a separate section in which we installed the works that inspired her for this particular installation. She was inspired by some Central American dolls, but also this hat that we had in our collection from the early 20th century in Turkey. And so these materials were inspiring for her because she really plays with the idea of mathematics and the qualities of mathematics and weaving. And so opening this up to sort of think about her work as a global artist and informed by global textile technologies, it was important for us to have a space where both her work could be represented, but also the source of her inspiration could be represented as well. So that was something that we had to personally consider when displaying Alex's work. And also, I mean, in the sense that it wasn't traditional in that we wanted audience members to literally walk through the space. So this designation between the work and the visitor was really sort of simplified. And we needed to, again, deal with those challenges of, yes, people can walk through this space, but how do we ensure the safety of the work and make sure that people aren't knocking things over or tripping, which became an issue with one particular work. We wanted to make sure that there wasn't this barrier because it was important to the artist, even though we traditionally would have had a barrier between the work and the visitor. It was important for her for that conversation to be integrated. So respecting that interest was something that we prioritized in this particular show. And so that's sort of the work that I've done of many exhibitions over the decade. But I also wanted to sort of situate the talk today for where I see textiles going by speaking to some of the work that I'm currently doing as an independent curator, guest curator, and museum consultant. So this summer, artist Chakaya Booker, I will be working on an exhibition that opens in July at the Sarasota Art Museum at Ringling College of Art and Design. The exhibition is called Chakaya Booker Surface Pressure. And Chakaya is an artist who is known as a sculptor, even though she works across media. And Chakaya, what's fascinating about her in particular is that she began her work as a sculptor in textiles, and a lot of her early work is focused in textiles. She sort of conceives of herself as a sculptor, and you can see in this image here from her Foundling Warrior series, images that were taken in the 1990s. She's very focused on repurposing materials, but the way in which she dresses and still dresses to this day is focused on celebrating the expression of the African diaspora. So she wears intricate clothes, head wraps, and things that to her really speak to not only her identity as a Black artist, but also to her overall aesthetic, which is, in my opinion, very much grounded in textile practice. And so she's known for taking recycled materials, specifically tires, twisting them, weaving them, and manipulating them into these sort of intricate compositions that sort of speak to personal experience. She sort of sees the treads on a tire to be similar to the way in which a person ages, interacts with environments. She's also very interested in our effect on the environment and the industries that have cropped up around technology, and specifically the tire. When you think about, automobiles and car culture and consumerism, these are things that are all very important to the type of work that she does. This work, Industrial Perpetuosity, is actually two pieces that sort of come together, sort of looking like their hands that are sort of almost touching but not. She's very interested in thinking about the idea of connection. So the themes for the exhibition are really focused on her approach to surface design, which you can see here uses a variety of materials, molds, and then the end result are these really impressive sculptures that speak to accumulation, this idea of juxtaposition, taking materials that shouldn't go together and creating new meaning. So she's transforming them. And she's also thinking a lot about connection. And in the case of both connection and transformation, it's interesting for me as a curator working with someone who conceives of materials that would be generally associated with industry, and if art, sculpture, transforming it into what appears to be fabric, giving it the sense of energy, movement, and dynamism that we often associate with fabric or textile sort of moving with the environment. And it's something that's incredibly fascinating about her work. And for myself as a curator, and even amongst colleagues here in the state of Florida, this idea of thinking about textiles in new ways, thinking about textile techniques that may or may not incorporate what we traditionally consider fabric or fabric materials, is a direction that we see a lot of her art going. And even though Chakaya is not based in Florida, she's based in Pennsylvania and New York, being able to sort of bring that conversation to a region that is already very interested in exploring these themes has been really important. And it also applies to larger scholarship. So as Lucy mentioned, I am the co-author of a forthcoming book that is focused on presenting a expanded understanding of what constitutes as art in the United States. I mentioned as an art historian, my education was grounded in what would be considered traditional, and I hate to say fine arts, because that often is the case, and was the case, that if I were to learn about textiles, it was always on the periphery and generally in the context of, say, African art. And so our book is really sort of engaged with sort of thinking about that conversation, thinking about the constructions that we've made between high and low, and specifically integrating textiles, craft, and women and people of color who have worked in this media for centuries, but have not always had the recognition that, say, painting and sculpture has. And in the case of Chakaya, it was a wonderful coincidence that she was included in our book before I was even approached to do this project. And this is her particular piece called Acid Rain, which is a monumental work. It is massive. And part of what was important to us with this book was not only addressing the history of textiles. And as you see, we included a textile piece by Indigenous artist Jeffrey Gibson on the cover, but also thinking about the dialogue that contemporary artists have had with the past. So the book is complemented by these sections called Contemporary Connection, where current artists, contemporary artists are making work that speaks to a longer traditional history, a longer history of art making in the United States, what these visual representations have meant, how they've served to sort of build the concept of our nation, and how we can expand those conversations to include media such as fiber and textiles that aren't often a part of what an entry-level art history, humanities, or BFA student might be exposed to. And so the book is written in a way that is meant to be accessible for students new to art history, to sort of help them frame important questions about the nature of the art historical canon, who's in it, who gets left out, and what are the important conversations that we need to have in those gaps. And so I sort of also wanted to wrap up before we have questions for thinking about considerations for not just curatorial planning, but also audience interaction. I am a strong believer in audience-centered curation, which is a growing field within museum studies. So thinking about not just putting works on a wall, but also thinking about how principally the visitor will engage with that work, bring their own interpretation to it, and keeping that in mind, top of mind when you're planning for a gallery's layout. And in the case of textiles, that's really important. So as I mentioned earlier with Haitian's work, our exhibition, I guess technically instead of 3 spaces, it really is four main spaces that were at the Funk Center. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were having a conversation throughout the exhibition itself. So for light and shadow, we sort of wanted visitors to come in with this sense of where Haitian's work had been up to that point, and transition in the lower right into the first of one of 3 of her installations, sort of thinking about making sure that we had the entire space for visitors to interact with. And you can see here we have some students who visited from Florida Tech's minor in business and innovation. This is a class taught by the business school. And so we wanted to make sure that visitors, regardless of their background, were able to come in and really allow the works to give them the space to walk around, to ask questions, to sort of connect with both the artist and the space itself. And so this was a long running program that we did with the business school to sort of bring them in and think about specifically aspects of problem solving and creativity that, again, I feel regardless of your discipline are important. And it's why thinking from an interdisciplinary lens about the way that art can influence audiences, being mindful of meeting your audience where they're at. So that was very important for us as a university museum. So university and academic museum, meaning that we, instead of being standalone, we not only were located on campus, but directly reported to the governing body of the university itself. And then returning back to Reimagine, again, considerations for Carrie C. and how she envisioned this particular panel series. What's interesting about Carrie's embroidery is that she would tell the story about showing her embroideries in shows and people saying, well, that's not embroidered. What do you mean? And her having to flip the piece to the back so that people could get an appreciation and understanding for her process. So she wanted to make that conversation a sort of focal point for our show. And so with the way that we installed it at the Funk Center was thinking about how a visitor, as opposed to most of the time we would say don't touch, but this was an instance in which the artist wanted the visitor to be able to interact with the piece, to touch it, and more specifically to turn it. And so we had to come up with an inventive way to add these sort of hinges that you can sort of see at the top, that sort of long silver bracket there. So we had to think about installing the works as hinged pieces that would allow visitors, with gloves that we provided and signage that made it very clear, to turn the work so that they could interact with it, see the back, and also kind of interestingly sort of create their own version of the composition. We had some works that were open where some people would close others and sort of manipulate the piece so that it became itself a really dynamic and interactive way for visitors to connect firsthand with the artist, create something new, but also have that sort of inside view into not only the materials she used, but the processes that were so important to her and being transparent about them. And so I find that as a curator, working now post pandemic, that the before times, as we like to call it, for exhibition development, for me personally, have shifted quite a bit. So initially, I would work in creating sort of storyboards that were often, as in the case on the left, my dining room table, that I could spread things out on, think about the connections between pieces, and then communicate that in the office with physical models in which objects could be scaled and applied to the wall, right? So working in a very physical way. Post-pandemic, however, I find that that's changed a lot. And so even though in the case of myself working on this exhibition of Chakaya Booker's work, I keep a physical journal that allows me to interact with the materials, think about samples, sketch out ideas, working at a significant distance from the museum in which I'm working for at the moment, and with an artist who's based in New York. So the artist is in New York, I'm in Central Florida, and this museum is in South Florida. So communicating in three distinct ways has meant sort of thinking about how digital resources can help me as a curator communicate ideas. And so this is not the final version of the exhibition in any way, but what I've had to do was sort of think about, this is a design, architecture design software called SketchUp. That, by the way, has a free version, which is what I use here. And it allowed me to not only build a digitally scaled model of Sarasota Art Museum specific exhibition space in which I'm working, but also to scale the works themselves and think again about how a visitor, what's the conversation I want the exhibition to have, how should the visitor be positioned, and then also how can I communicate those ideas to both the museum that I'm working for and the artists that I'm working with. So I found that even though this isn't necessarily representative of the gallery's final layout, the way that I communicate information to constituents has changed quite a bit post-pandemic. And so that's certainly a consideration that I think most of us either have had or will have to have in thinking about how to do this work for the future, certainly when you're working with experimental materials. And so since I have just a few minutes left, I just wanted to also sort of ground this in, why any of this matters, right? And I've talked a lot about audience, but for us at the Funk Center at the time, working for 5 years with a Title I elementary school that was located less than a mile from our campus, thinking about the way that experimentation and innovation could be seeds for children, and thinking about not only how they approach their own problems, but think of themselves as creatives, as artists. And so doing a particular workshop program that we did for 5 years called The Power of Imagination, we worked with these same contemporary artists to sort of think about, in the case of the middle image, how creating a work that was obviously with Sunken Dreams meant to commemorate a very sad disaster, thinking about the way the children in our region could think about their hopes, their dreams, the way that those hopes and dreams interact with this projector here showing the shadow cast in the background was a really important and rewarding sense of engaging with these audiences. And for these students, many of whom had never visited a museum for the first time, thinking of innovation within the idea of textiles was sort of making connections that for us were fundamental to our mission, and also fundamental to the way that I see myself as a curator, my audiences, and the considerations that I have to make for thinking about the way that works connect us to one another, and to a wider audience, and to what we hope is a more inclusive and responsible future. So yeah, that is what I have. I will stop screen sharing now and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Keidra. And we do have some questions. First about Carrie C's work.
Mhm.
Someone wants to know the rough dimensions of, I think they're referring to the piece with the hinges. How big was that?
Oh my goodness. So offhand, and I'm trying to think, they were at least, let's see, I'm the person that was in the picture for scale. I think they were at least 3 feet across. So they were square pieces, 3 to 4 feet across, and there were 6 of them.
Okay, great. And with the VHS tape piece, they want to know, did you have to wear masks? Was it toxic in the air for a long period of time? And I want to know, is this the most dangerous piece of art you've ever worked with?
Comparatively, yes, though, I mean, when you're having to stand up on a ladder and install things, you never like danger is relative, right? We never had any falls in the galleries, but it's always a risk when you're working with artists who are working with large scale works. And no, they didn't have to wear a mask. It was more so about the material seeping into the skin.
Hmm.
So that's why the gloves were important. It was more so about the manipulation of the material that was dangerous. And again, it's, if you accidentally touch it once, no one was going to fall out. But it's the idea of the repeated exposure, because we often take for granted, that our hands are membranes. And just like we can affect, textiles with the oils on our hands by touching them, conversely, the opposite can happen too. And for us, especially with works like this, it was always important for us to build in time. So we always would paint our galleries in between. So off gassing was really important for us as a consideration for the safety of the work as well, making sure that the paint that we used, even though we used paint that was specifically meant to make sure that we sort of minimize that, it was still important to give that lead time to make sure that the safety of the works as well were upheld.
And could you give some examples of the practical steps that you've had to take to protect the installation art?
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of that, especially if we were dealing with either experimental materials or sculptures of any kind. So we had a wonderful exhibition of basketry from Japan. That was a traveling show that we did, that we hosted from a national basketry organization. And so with those being sculptures, we had to make sure that people have book bags and purses that can knock into pedestals. And so we often secured works with using a sort of thin piece of mylar that would protect, again, thinking about the paint and how that interacts with the works of art, that would protect the work at specific points, to make sure that there was no actual interaction between the painted pedestal and the work, but also for helping, in the case of some pieces, securing the work. And we used vitrines, which are these glass cases, as plastic cases, as often as we could, but that wasn't always available for every work. So making sure that we secured it, whether oftentimes it might be sewing, if it's a piece of fabric, making light stitches that would allow us to sew the work and make sure that it was stitched down, things that would seem invisible to the average person walking through, but from a preparator and collection standpoint, making sure that we were prioritizing the safety of the work.
Mhm. And I think a lot of us probably saw the news item about the Jeff Koons sculpture that got knocked over last week, 2 weeks ago. So that's got to be like every curator's worst nightmare.
It is, and it's also interesting because it is a very, and no disrespect to Miami at all, but it is a very Miami aesthetic. We have found that working in contemporary spaces in Miami, they don't want that division, even whether it's
Mm.
collector or an artist. Oftentimes they want that connection between an artist and the viewer to seem seamless. And so unfortunately that is the risk that you take when that happens. And sometimes that is guided by artists and collectors who don't want that barrier. So but
Mhm.
yes, it is nightmare fuel.
This question says, how can people who are interested in interdisciplinary approaches to art find connection points into things like technology?
Yeah, and so with me, that obviously comes from sort of a sink or swim situation, right? Like I spent a decade at a university that the overwhelming majority of the students were engineering and engineering majors, and so thinking about okay, so I'll say, for example, our basketry exhibition was by and large the most popular show we have ever had for engineers. Like, those were the people that came to the gallery. And we realized that their connection point was that mathematical spatial quality that the works were having. And so oftentimes that means sort of breaking down a work to its most basic points and thinking about, okay, what are ways in which someone might, who's unfamiliar with this, have an entry point. So another example I'll give is an exhibition that was a traveling show of Hmong textiles, which was a diaspora that came to the United States after the devastation of the Vietnam War. We don't have a large Hmong population in Florida. However, almost 40% of Florida Tech's students were international students. So our connecting point for that exhibition was the nature of immigration, was the nature of home, was the nature of cultural heritage. And so we use that as a sort of framing piece for not only the works themselves, but also the activities that we designed as part of the exhibition, so that there was this constant conversation from the beginning of the show that asked you to sort of, you know, talk about culture, to places that, to stations that were specifically designed to help you learn more about Hmong culture, but also think about yourself, your identity, where your culture comes from, and how it connects, as Florida being such a multicultural place. So.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, Paula wants to know, what is your take on sloppy craft, in quotes, in textile art, work in museum or gallery shows that ignore good quality technique?
Well, I think that this is where artists need to be, very mindful about what the specific mission and interests are for the institutions, galleries, museums that you may be submitting and showing your work to. I know for me personally, it was always great to have, artists send postcards of their work. I would keep a separate file because for us at the Funk Center, we tried, so we had exhibitions 3 times a year, sort of corresponding to the academic calendar, spring, summer, and fall. And so for each year with 3 shows, we were constantly trying to make sure that we're rotating the themes that we addressed. So if we did a fashion show one year, we wouldn't do a fashion show that same year, or maybe the next year. So we may do a show. We had a show that was called Flora and Fiber that we curated from our permanent collection that was focused very much on materials and technique. So thinking about that from a global perspective. And so the aims of each exhibition might determine whether or not an artist or a museum or a particular exhibition work for a very particular focus. Like if the focus is on technique, an exhibition might have a show that focuses on technique, but it also might have a show that focuses more on experimentation and iteration and new ideas. And we've had a mixture of both. And we had a large docent population who were all makers in a traditional sense that very much focused on technique. And so we oftentimes had to talk a little bit about, contemporary arts and how these conversations can be a part of it, but still acknowledging, the very real work, time, effort, innovation that all goes into creating textiles, regardless of what the specificity is in terms of process and technique. So I say they all have their place. Sorry.
That's a good answer. Good answer. Yeah. Do you have a favorite part of the curatorial process?
Oh, well, for me, I think people don't always think about how long the process is, right? Like you can work for an exhibition. I mean, ideally having exhibitions at least 2 years out was a thing that was kind of a staple of mine, but really starting exhibition development would usually start a year out. For me, the most exciting part, and I think that's why I'm so fascinated by the work that I do now as a doctoral student, is research. I love learning new things. And maybe that's because I came to textiles as a, so-called outsider. I didn't come from a textile background. And so I feel that it was a very steep learning curve for me every exhibition. And I also learned so much from our fiber arts community, our quilters, our docents. They help teach me. And I think that that was always something that even to this day, I get really excited about when I'm working on a new show is being inspired, learning about the artist, learning about things that I haven't before. So that aspect of, I guess, I don't know, discovery is always to me the most interesting and fascinating of that process.
And one person is asking, how do I learn more about ways to introduce technology into my art?
Yeah, well, I would definitely say, to keep an eye out for artists who are working in these veins. SDA has a wonderful journal. Surface Design Association has a wonderful journal called Surface Design Journal. And oftentimes, subscriptions to magazines that are sort of showcasing both, established artists, but also emerging artists, right? I would say certainly be connected to what's happening in BFA programs and MFA programs. There are wonderful guilds, both in quilting and in fiber arts, that are regionally based. So I know Miami has a big one, South Florida has a big one. And so connecting with like-minded individuals who may be doing these types of explorations locally, I think are also a really good way to stay engaged about, just doing new things, integrating new things. And for me, conferences are where I get a lot of my inspiration. And now, post pandemic, with so many things being available for free online, I know the Smithsonian had a great a symposium on craft earlier this week, and their programs are always free. And so, getting on the listservs of these kinds of institutions where you receive alerts about this kind of stuff, it could be a great way to inspire and allow you to connect more about working in those types of processes and media.
And I thought this question was interesting, and it's probably going to be one of our last questions. Someone is asking, after an installation has finished its exhibit, what typically happens to it? Does it get sold and put in an office or a building somewhere, or do people just take it home and store it? What usually happens?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this the same way that well, not the same way, but similar to the way that I answered the question about exhibition of technique. It depends. It really, for a museum, for the Funk Center, for instance, or even Sarasota Art Museum at Ringling, they are museum spaces. So principally, there was no selling happening within the gallery. There was a hard line drawn between if you are selling this work, then you can contact the artist directly. You can contact their gallery representation directly, because we often work with artists that have gallery representation. So the selling aspect is done through that arm. But if you're in a gallery space that is actively selling the work of the artist, then the conversation is very different. But traditionally for a museum, what we would do is deinstall the work. We usually have what's called condition reporting, where when we receive a work, we make sure that we know any damage, how we received it, anything in a photographic process. We do the same thing before we send it back. We deinstall it, we take pictures, we note the condition that the work was in, and we send all that back to the artist or the gallery so that there's a clear trail. Because again, if people knock things over or damage things, from an insurance perspective, you want to make sure that that information is there and available, and that there's a clear paper trail. So in the end, we would just send things back. But sometimes that can be a process, but for the most part, selling would be a different entity than a museum.
And we are just about out of time, but I want to ask one last question. Maybe if you have a quick answer for it, what's something that as a curator, you wish all artists knew about exhibiting or anything?
It's so funny. And artists can be very artists. They have such a personal relationship with their work, and I always find it actually inspiring to see how that conversation shifts when it's on display. Um, and I do think that artists should be mindful of the fact that sometimes conversations do shift, and there are some artists like Chakaya Booker who's very open to that. She doesn't even want to give a description to specific works because she wants the visitor to bring their own. And so I think it's important for curators, for artists and even curators to realize that people are going to bring their own interpretations to your work. And I wouldn't consider that to be limiting. I would think about the ways in which that can expand the conversation about your making and process, and maybe be inspiration for a future line of thinking or body of work. So
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Keidra. It's such a pleasure to have you speaking on Textile Talks today. I really enjoyed it. And to our audience, we will be back again next week, same time, same place, for a QSOS, that's Quilters Save Our Stories, interview with Jen Hewitt, conducted by Lisa Woolfork, and that is presented by the Quilt Alliance. Also a reminder, next week is the start of daylight savings time here in the US and Canada. So if you live outside of North America, please double check your time zone conversion. And as always, you can find all the details about upcoming textile talks at SAQA.com/textile talks. If you enjoy our programming, why not tell a friend or support us financially with a donation at SAQA.com/TT support. And we will be back again next week. I hope you all have a fantastic Wednesday.